The courtroom was full that morning. People sat on hard wooden benches, leaning forward, waiting for the case to unfold. Some had come because they were directly involved, while others simply wanted to witness what everyone had been whispering about for weeks. Trials always drew attention, but this one carried a weight that made even strangers curious. The air itself seemed heavy, as though the walls of the old courthouse held secrets that wanted to escape. At the center of it all sat the judge, robed in black, his face serious and stern. He had a reputation in the city, known for his strictness, his sharp tongue, and his ability to control even the most chaotic of trials. Lawyers feared him, defendants avoided eye contact, and the audience often whispered about how no one could ever shake his confidence. He ruled the courtroom like a king rules his court. To most people, he was untouchable. The sound of papers rustling echoed across the silent room as the clerk announced the case. Lawyers shuffled their notes, the defendant shifted uncomfortably, and a hush fell over the crowd. All eyes were on the judge, who adjusted his glasses and prepared to begin. The usual rhythm of a trial seemed to be in motion. Questions, answers, objections, and rulings were expected to follow. Everyone assumed it would be like every other trial. Long arguments, heated exchanges, and finally a judgment handed down by the man at the bench. But that day was different. In the back of the room, unnoticed at first, sat a young girl. She was quiet, blending in with the crowd. No one paid attention to her. After all, she seemed too ordinary to matter in a place where lawyers and officials carried the weight of authority. Her small figure and calm demeanor did not suggest that she had anything important to say. She sat with her hands clasped tightly, her eyes fixed on the judge with a gaze far stronger than her appearance suggested. As the trial began, the lawyers presented their opening statements. The prosecution spoke confidently, painting a picture of certainty. The defense countered, careful in tone, attempting to sway the judge's opinion in small ways. The usual battle of words unfolded, and the judge listened with his typical expression of control, occasionally raising a hand to silence an unnecessary objection. The rhythm of the courtroom seemed unshakable, like a well-rehearsed performance. Yet the girl's eyes never left the judge. She wasn't just listening to the case, she was waiting. She could feel her heart beating faster with every passing second. To anyone watching her closely, it would have been clear that she wasn't just an observer. She carried something inside her, a secret, a truth, that pressed heavily on her chest. And though she tried to remain still, her hands trembled slightly as she clenched them tighter. The more the judge spoke, the more restless she became. Minutes turned into nearly an hour, and the trial carried on. Witnesses were called, documents were presented, and the crowd shifted uncomfortably on their benches, listening but also growing tired of the formal language. That was when it happened. Without warning, the girl stood up. The sudden scrape of wood against the floor broke the monotony of the trial. Heads turned instantly, eyes narrowing with surprise. Who was this girl? Why was she standing? In a courtroom, silence was sacred and interruptions were rare, almost unthinkable. Yet there she was, small, almost fragile, but with an expression that carried more strength than anyone expected. The defense lawyer paused mid-sentence, his mouth left open as he turned toward her. The prosecutor frowned, clearly annoyed. The judge, taken aback, slammed his gavel lightly against the bench. His voice thundered across the room. "Order! Sit down immediately. This is not the place for disruptions." His tone was sharp, the same tone that had silenced countless others before her. But this time the girl didn't move. Her lips parted and her voice, though trembling, carried clearly across the room. Everyone leaned forward. Even those who had begun to feel sleepy were suddenly wide awake. The atmosphere shifted in a single heartbeat. The sound of her words echoed through the courtroom, louder in effect than the gavel itself. 4 words. Just 4 simple words. The room froze. The judge's face, usually so steady, drained of color. For the first time in years, those who had attended his trial saw something no one thought possible. Fear. His hand, still gripping the gavel, trembled slightly before he set it down. His eyes, sharp and confident just moments ago, now darted nervously toward the girl. Whispers rippled through the crowd. No one understood the full meaning of what had just been said, but everyone could feel its power. Lawyers glanced at each other, confused yet curious. The defendant, who had seemed defeated moments earlier, looked up with new hope. Even the clerks, who usually kept their eyes down, raised their heads to witness the unfolding moment. The girl stood tall despite her shaking body. She had said what she came to say, and now the truth was no longer hers alone. It hung in the air, unshakable. Every heartbeat in the courtroom seemed to wait for what would happen next. The judge leaned back in his chair, trying to regain control. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and attempted to mask the fear that had broken through his usual mask of authority. But it was too late. Everyone had seen the change in his expression. Everyone had noticed the way his hands gripped the edge of his desk too tightly, the way his eyes refused to meet the girl's steady gaze. The silence stretched on. It was the kind of silence that pressed on everyone's chest, making it difficult to breathe. 1,000 unspoken questions filled the air. Who was this girl? Why did her words shake the judge so deeply? What hidden connection existed between them? For the first time in a long time, the courtroom was no longer under the judge's control. It belonged to the moment, to the truth that had just slipped into the open. And though no one knew exactly what would follow, they all understood one thing. This trial was no longer about the case on paper. It had become something far bigger, something that would change everything. And it had all begun with 4 words, spoken by a girl no one had expected to matter. The silence after her 4 words still hung heavy in the room. It was as if time had paused, like the clocks on the wall had stopped ticking. No one dared to move, not even to breathe too loudly. The lawyers froze with their notes in their hands. The clerk sat rigid, and the audience leaned forward as though caught in a spell. The girl's voice was not loud, yet it had struck harder than any argument made by the attorneys that morning. The judge's face told a story of its own. His pale skin, his tightened lips, the way his eyes darted toward the girl and then quickly away. Every detail betrayed a man who had just been shaken to his core. For a moment, he tried to mask it with authority. He lifted his gavel again as if banging it down could erase what had just been spoken, but his hand hesitated midair. The hesitation was small, but it was enough for everyone to notice. "Order in the court," he demanded, his voice sharp, but his tone lacked its usual certainty. The strength he was known for had slipped. The girl, still standing, did not flinch. She looked directly at him, her hands trembling slightly, but her chin lifted high. It was clear she had not spoken out of impulse. Her 4 words were deliberate, chosen carefully, as though she had carried them with her for a long time, waiting for the right moment. Someone from the audience whispered, "What did she just say?" And others leaned toward one another, repeating the words under their breath, trying to grasp their meaning. The air was thick with confusion, curiosity, and unease. The defense lawyer finally broke the silence, his voice cautious. "Your Honor, perhaps we should allow this young lady to explain herself?" He spoke carefully, almost respectfully, knowing he had sensed a crack in the judge's control. The judge shot him a glare, but even that glare lacked its usual intimidation. He turned back toward the girl and said firmly, "This courtroom is no place for interruptions. Sit down immediately or you will be removed." But she remained where she was. Her voice, though not loud, was steady this time. "I cannot sit down," she said. "Not when the truth is being hidden." Those words sent another ripple across the room. People shifted uncomfortably. Truth. The word itself was heavy, dangerous, impossible to ignore in a courtroom. The judge banged his gavel harder this time, the sound echoing across the room. "Enough, you are out of line." "This is your last warning." His voice rose, trying to reassert dominance. Yet even as he spoke, everyone noticed how his hands shook slightly, how his eyes avoided hers. The girl took a deep breath. It was clear her body was fighting her. Her knees trembled, her throat felt tight, but something inside her pushed her forward. She was afraid, but her courage was stronger than her fear. Slowly, she stepped away from the bench where she had been sitting and moved closer to the center of the courtroom. Every eye followed her. It was the boldness of the action that stunned the audience most. In a place where rules were strict, where even lawyers feared speaking out of turn, a young girl was walking straight into the heart of it all, challenging the one man no one ever dared to question. The prosecutor stood up quickly. "Your Honor, this is unacceptable. She is disrupting the trial. Security should remove her at once." His tone was sharp, but even he seemed unsettled, as if he could sense there was more to this than just a simple interruption. But before the guards could move, the girl spoke again and her words froze them in place. "If you remove me, you remove the truth," she said, her eyes locked firmly on the judge. The room went still again. The defendant, who had been silent for most of the trial, raised his head. For the first time since the case began, he looked hopeful. His eyes searched the girl's face as though trying to understand who she was and why she had spoken for him. The audience, unable to control their curiosity, began whispering again. Some believed she must know something important. Others thought she was just a reckless girl seeking attention. But no matter what they believed, none of them could deny the change in the judge's expression. He looked like a man cornered. The girl paused, her breathing uneven. She knew the risk she was taking. Speaking against a judge in open court was not something anyone did lightly, yet she had been carrying the truth for too long, and silence had become unbearable. If she stayed quiet, injustice would continue. If she spoke, she could face consequences, but at least the truth would no longer be buried. She clenched her fists, summoning all the courage she could find within herself. Then, in a voice louder than before, she repeated the 4 words she had first spoken. This time, the words hit harder, like a hammer striking stone. The judge's gavel fell from his hand, clattering loudly against the wooden bench. Gasps filled the courtroom. For a man known for his iron control, dropping the gavel was unthinkable. It was a symbol of power slipping away. His face turned white again, and for a moment he looked like someone who had seen a ghost. He leaned back, his lips pressed tightly together, unable to form a reply. The girl's eyes softened, but her tone remained firm. "I will not sit down," she said quietly, "because if I do, the truth dies here." The audience erupted in whispers. Some stood to see better. The tension was almost unbearable. Everyone sensed that what was happening was no ordinary courtroom drama. This was history being made in front of them. The judge finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Do you understand what you are saying?" His words carried fear rather than authority. The girl nodded. "Yes, and you understand it too." Those words hit him harder than any blow. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests tightly. For the first time, the courtroom no longer belonged to him. It belonged to her, and with every heartbeat, the courage she displayed grew larger, stronger, more unshakable. She was no longer just a quiet observer. She had become the center of it all. The gavel lying on the desk no longer carried any weight. For years, it had been the judge's symbol of power, the sound that silenced every voice in the room, the object that reminded everyone that he, and he alone, had the final say. But now, lying there abandoned, it looked like nothing more than a piece of wood, and everyone knew why. 4 words had taken away its power. The judge sat frozen, his body stiff but his eyes restless. He avoided looking directly at the girl, but every now and then his gaze flicked toward her, quick and nervous before darting away again. The audience had never seen him like this. To them, he had always been a towering figure, someone beyond fear or weakness. Yet here he was, pale and shaken, his hands twitching ever so slightly as he gripped the edges of his chair. The girl did not move. She stood in the center of the courtroom like a flame that refused to go out. No matter how many times the judge tried to smother it, her voice had been steady, her courage undeniable, but inside her chest her heart raced wildly. Every second she stood there felt like an eternity. She had expected resistance, anger, even punishment, but she had not expected to see fear in the judge's eyes. That was when she knew her words had struck deeper than she had imagined. The defense lawyer, sensing the shift in atmosphere, rose slowly. His eyes darted between the judge and the girl, carefully measuring the moment. "Your Honor," he began cautiously, "it seems this young woman has something important to reveal. Perhaps we should allow her to speak." It was a bold suggestion. In most trials, a lawyer would never dare to address the judge this way. But this was no longer an ordinary trial. Everyone could feel that the balance of power in the room had shifted. The prosecutor, on the other hand, shot up angrily. "This is outrageous. This trial cannot be turned into a spectacle. She has no standing here. She is disrupting proceedings." His voice was sharp, but beneath his confidence there was unease. Even he could see that the judge was not himself. And if the judge's authority crumbled, so would the entire foundation of the case he was building. The judge finally raised a hand, silencing them both. His voice, when it came, was not the commanding tone everyone was used to. It was quieter, thinner, like a man forcing words out of a dry throat. Who are you?" he asked the girl. The question startled everyone. The judge, the man who was supposed to be in control, was now asking questions like a confused witness instead of giving orders like a ruler. The girl held her ground. "Who I am doesn't matter," she replied. "What matters is the truth, and you know exactly what those words mean." A murmur spread through the audience. People leaned closer to one another, whispering guesses. Some tried to recall the 4 words she had spoken, repeating them softly, trying to uncover their hidden meaning. But the one person who seemed to understand them perfectly was the judge himself. His face betrayed him. Every attempt to hide his reaction only made it clearer. His lips pressed tightly together, his jaw clenched, his forehead damp with sweat. The courtroom, which had always feared his judgment, now watched his struggle with fascination. It was like seeing a fortress develop cracks in its walls, cracks that grew wider with each passing second. The girl took another step forward. "Why don't you tell them?" she asked, her voice steady but piercing. "Why don't you explain why those words made you drop your gavel?" The judge's breath caught in his throat. He shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his robe as though its weight had suddenly become unbearable. He glanced at the court clerk, then at the lawyers, then at the audience. But no one came to his aid. Everyone was waiting, their curiosity too strong to ignore. "I said enough," he snapped finally, but even his anger sounded hollow. The words did not carry the same authority they once did. The girl's eyes softened slightly, not out of pity, but because she realized the truth was already showing itself without her needing to say more. His reaction was proof enough that her words mattered. "If you want me to stop," she said calmly, "then you need to face the truth, because I won't leave this courtroom until it's spoken." A gasp went through the audience. It was the kind of courage they rarely saw, especially from someone so young standing against a man so powerful. Some nodded quietly, admiring her bravery. Others looked nervous, wondering what consequences would follow. The defendant, seated quietly until then, could no longer hold back. "She's right," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "Let her speak. If she knows the truth, then let it come out. I've been waiting for it too." The words only added fuel to the fire. Now even the defendant, the person whose fate hung in the balance, was supporting her. The prosecutor slammed his hand against the table. "This is absurd. We cannot let this child derail a legal process with vague statements and emotional outbursts." But the audience wasn't convinced. People had seen the judge pale, had seen his gavel slip from his hand. They had heard the tremor in his voice. They knew something real was happening, something deeper than a mere outburst. The judge leaned forward, pressing his hands against the bench, his knuckles white. "Do you have any idea what you're risking?" he asked her, his voice a low growl now, filled with both anger and desperation. The girl did not blink. "Do you?" she shot back. Her reply hit him harder than a blow. He leaned back, his lips parting slightly in shock. For the first time, the audience saw the judge speechless. The silence stretched. It was heavy, suffocating, but also thrilling. Every person in the courtroom knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. The balance of power had shifted completely. The judge, once untouchable, now looked like a man exposed, fragile, cornered by 4 words and the courage of a girl who refused to be silent. In that moment, his reaction said more than any confession could. His pale face, his trembling hands, his broken voice. Those were the signs of a man haunted by the truth. And though he tried desperately to hold on to his authority, everyone in the room could feel it slipping away. The girl stood tall, her fear still inside her but no longer visible. She had done what no one else dared to do. She had shaken the judge to his core. And as she stood there, the courtroom realized that this trial was no longer just about the case written on paper. It had become about something far greater, something hidden, something dangerous, something that was now demanding to be revealed. The judge's reaction had told them everything they needed to know. The room no longer felt like a courtroom. It felt like a storm had broken inside 4 walls, shaking everyone who sat there. The air was thick with whispers, gasps, and the pounding of hearts that couldn't keep calm after what they had witnessed. The judge, who had always been a figure of control, was now visibly crumbling. The girl's words were like a lantern shining into a dark corner that no one dared to look at before. The girl stood firm in the center, her eyes steady despite the weight of so many stares fixed on her. She could feel the doubt, the curiosity, and the hope swirling in the room, but she didn't allow herself to get distracted. She had waited too long for this. Today, she had promised herself, the truth would no longer remain hidden. The judge tried to clear his throat as though forcing his authority back into his voice. "Enough," he said, but it came out weak, almost like a plea instead of a command. His hands fumbled with the papers in front of him, though he wasn't really reading them. He was only trying to buy time to stop the cracks from widening. But the more he resisted, the more obvious it became that something was wrong. The defense lawyer, sensing an opportunity, leaned forward. His voice was careful but insistent. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the reaction we have all just witnessed cannot be ignored. This young woman clearly holds information that may be vital to this case. Denying her the chance to speak would be unjust." The prosecutor immediately objected, his tone sharp and desperate. "This is completely irregular. She is not a witness, she has not been sworn in, and her words have no place in this courtroom." But the audience was no longer siding with him. People shifted in their seats, murmuring their agreement with the defense. They had seen with their own eyes the judge's reaction, and no rulebook could erase that moment. The girl spoke again, her voice cutting through the noise. "I don't need to be sworn in to tell the truth." "The truth doesn't need permission." Gasps echoed around the room. Some clapped their hands against their knees quietly, unable to contain their support. Others simply stared at the judge, waiting, almost demanding an explanation for his silence. The judge slammed his hand against the bench, but his face betrayed him. It was pale, almost gray, and beads of sweat formed along his forehead. "You will not speak another word," he shouted, but his voice cracked in the middle, breaking the force he was trying to project. The girl's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with determination. "You're afraid of what I'll say?" she answered quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. The judge froze, his lips pressed tightly together, his chest rising and falling as though he were struggling to breathe. The defendant finally spoke, his voice trembling but loud enough for all to hear. "If she knows something that proves my innocence, then this trial is meaningless without her words. She must be heard." His plea stirred even more whispers. The judge looked cornered, like a man caught between fire and water with no way out. He leaned back, his eyes flickering toward the door as though escape were even possible. But there was no escape. Not now. Not with dozens of eyes watching, waiting, and demanding answers. The girl stepped closer, her voice calmer now, but sharp with purpose. "Years ago," she began slowly, "a decision was made in this very courtroom. It was made by you." She pointed gently toward the bench. "And that decision destroyed lives." The audience gasped again, leaning forward in unison, their attention locked on her every word. Even those who had come out of boredom were now completely drawn in, unable to blink, unwilling to miss even a second. The judge's hand shook as he reached for his glass of water. He lifted it to his lips, but his grip was unsteady, and the glass clinked loudly against his teeth. He quickly set it down, trying to mask his fear, but the damage was already done. The girl's voice grew stronger. "That case may have been buried, the papers filed away, the people forgotten. But the truth does not stay buried forever. It waits, and today, it is here." The crowd erupted in whispers, louder this time, no longer afraid of breaking courtroom etiquette. People were demanding to know what she meant, who she was, what connection she had to the past. The prosecutor banged his fist against the table. "This is absurd. She is inventing stories." But no one believed him anymore. His voice sounded hollow compared to the weight of her words. The defense lawyer seized the moment. "Your Honor," he pressed firmly, "this girl's testimony cannot be ignored. If there is a hidden truth connected to your past rulings, then this trial cannot move forward until it is revealed. The integrity of this court is at stake." The judge closed his eyes for a moment as though trying to gather the strength to push back. But when he opened them again, he saw the eyes of the people. Dozens of pairs of eyes staring at him, not with respect, but with suspicion. And at the center, the girl's eyes, unwavering, demanding honesty. He looked trapped. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He tried again, his voice shaking. "You don't know what you're talking about." But the girl's reply came swiftly. "I know enough, and so do you." The audience gasped again, the weight of her words hitting them like thunder. In that moment, the courtroom no longer saw the judge as an untouchable figure. They saw him as a man, fragile, flawed, and guilty of something they did not yet fully understand. And once that image formed in their minds, there was no going back. The truth had begun to emerge, piece by piece. And though the judge tried desperately to hold it back, it was slipping through his fingers like sand, and everyone in the room knew whatever was hidden would not stay hidden much longer. The courtroom had changed completely. The tension that had once been quiet and tense now felt electric. People leaned forward in their seats, unable to look away, knowing that what was happening was far bigger than a simple trial. The judge, once untouchable, sat at the center of it all, his hands gripping the edges of the desk as though holding on for dear life. His gavel had been abandoned, lying forgotten on the polished wood, a silent testament to the power that had slipped from his hands. The girl stood in the middle of the room, her small frame radiating strength. Her breathing was steady now, though her heart still pounded. She had begun this day as a quiet observer, unnoticed in the back of the courtroom. No one thought she mattered. But the 4 words she had spoken had changed everything. They had shaken the foundation of authority, cracked the walls of control, and forced a hidden truth to the surface. For the first time, the judge did not speak with authority. His voice was hoarse, trembling slightly as he tried to gather his thoughts. "Do you know what you are doing?" he asked the girl. It was less a question than a plea, a desperate attempt to regain control. She did not flinch. "Yes," she said simply. "I know exactly what I'm doing. I am speaking the truth, and now it cannot be ignored." The audience murmured in agreement. They were leaning forward, eager to hear the truth she had carried for so long. Even those who had initially doubted her courage could feel the weight of her presence. Her words were no longer just an interruption, they were a force. The judge's hands trembled as he reached for the papers in front of him, trying to find something, anything, that could help him regain control. But the papers felt meaningless now. The courtroom had shifted, and he was no longer the one holding the power. The defense lawyer spoke next, his voice careful but firm. "Your Honor, if there is a truth that has been hidden in this courtroom, it must come out. The people involved in this case, and justice itself, deserve to know it." The prosecutor slammed his hand on the table. "This is ridiculous. We cannot allow a child to dictate the proceedings of a trial." But even he sounded unsure. Even he could sense that the momentum had shifted, and no amount of shouting could stop it. The girl stepped closer to the judge, her voice calm but unwavering. "You thought no one would ever find out. You thought the truth would stay buried, just like you buried it before. But the truth has a way of coming out. And today it is here." The audience gasped, the murmurs turning into whispers that quickly spread across the courtroom. Some leaned forward, trying to catch every word. Others sat back, shocked at the boldness of the girl and the obvious fear on the judge's face. The judge's face had gone completely pale. He leaned back in his chair, his hands pressing tightly to the armrests as though he could hold himself together physically if he could not mentally. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to command, but no words came out. The weight of the girl's accusation, the force of her courage, and the truth she represented left him speechless. The girl's voice rose slightly, cutting through the silence. "You cannot hide it anymore. You cannot ignore it. The people deserve to know what happened, and I will make sure they do." At that moment, something shifted. The defendant, who had been silent and anxious for most of the trial, spoke up. His voice was firm now, filled with hope. "She is right. If the truth has been hidden, we cannot move forward without it. Let her speak." The courtroom erupted in whispers. People turned to look at one another, nodding in agreement, leaning closer to hear what would happen next. Even the prosecutor, who had been so forceful in his objections, seemed to pause, unsure of how to proceed. The girl's eyes softened slightly, not with pity, but with determination. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about the people whose lives were affected by lies, by silence, and by fear. It's about justice, and it is about time it is done right." The judge leaned back, closing his eyes briefly, trying to compose himself. Memories of the past, of decisions he had made, of moments he thought were hidden forever, flooded into his mind. He could not stop them, and he knew the girl had awakened something that could not be undone. The courtroom waited. Every person present felt the tension, the gravity of the moment. It was clear that whatever would happen next would not only decide the outcome of the trial, but also change the lives of everyone involved. The girl stepped forward again. Years ago, a mistake was made here in this courtroom. A decision was passed that should never have been allowed, and people suffered because of it. I have the proof, and I am willing to show it to everyone here. The audience leaned forward in unison. People whispered among themselves, some nodding, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The tension was unbearable, yet thrilling. The judge tried to interrupt, but the girl raised her hand slightly, signaling that she was not finished. "You cannot deny it," she said, "and you cannot pretend it never happened. The truth will be seen, and it will be remembered." The defense lawyer nodded, encouraging her silently. The prosecutor looked helpless now, realizing that no amount of protest could stop the truth from emerging. The girl took a deep breath and began to lay out the facts she had discovered. She spoke carefully, her voice steady, walking everyone through the past events that had been hidden, the decisions that had been made in secret, and the consequences that had followed. She spoke of documents, witnesses, and events that no one had seen before. She spoke of the people affected, of the injustices suffered, and of the lies that had allowed it all to remain hidden. As she spoke, the judge's face changed. He went from pale to ashen, from ashen to gray. His hands gripped the desk, knuckles white as though holding on to the last remnants of control he still had. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, but her words were unstoppable, precise and undeniable. The courtroom was silent except for her voice. Every person present felt the weight of her words, the force of her courage, and the undeniable presence of truth. For the first time, the trial was no longer about legal arguments or formalities. It was about justice, and everyone knew it. Finally, after what felt like hours but was only minutes, she finished speaking. There was a brief moment of silence, and then the room erupted. Some clapped quietly, some whispered excitedly, and others sat in stunned silence, unable to believe what they had just heard. The judge leaned back, completely drained. The color slowly returned to his face, but his expression had changed forever. He had been exposed, challenged, and forced to confront the consequences of his actions. The courtroom had shifted, and he could not restore the balance he had once held. The defendant rose to his feet, his eyes filled with relief and gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly, directed at the girl. "You have given me hope and justice." The audience stood as well, some clapping, some nodding, all recognizing the courage of one small voice that had made the biggest difference. The girl stepped back, finally allowing herself a small smile. She had come into the courtroom unnoticed, a quiet observer in the back. But she had left as the voice of truth, the catalyst that had changed everything. The judge, now fully aware of what had happened, could only nod silently. He had lost control, but in that loss something had been restored, the balance of justice. And for the first time in a long time, the courtroom knew that justice was not just about rules or authority. It was about courage, truth, and the willingness of one person to stand up, no matter the risk, and say the words that had to be said. The gavel remained on the desk, forgotten, a symbol of the power that had shifted, a reminder that true authority comes not from fear or position, but from honesty and integrity. The girl quietly returned to her seat, her mission complete. She had spoken, and the truth had been heard. The courtroom would never forget her, and the judge would never forget the moment a young girl dared to speak. And the world changed because of 4 words. And with that, the trial took a new direction, one that would lead to justice being served and hidden truths finally exposed. It was a turning point that no one present would ever forget, a story of courage, honesty, and the power of speaking up when it mattered most.